We'll now begin Chapter 8 of Russian Sunrise with a synopsis on Chapter 7. Reading Chapter 7, we learned that there was a Romanov nobility organization, and they were holding their annual meeting at the Waldorf in New York City, and Marina Mikhailovna Romanov and her son Grigory, who was the potential heir to the throne of Russia, notified the members that a gentleman named Mikhail Romanov had made an application request to become a member of the organization, and after verifying his background and family history, he proved to be a direct threat to her son's position as potential heir to the throne. Mikhail Romanov very possibly was the descendant of the last known Russian Tsar, Nicholas II. It was agreed by the members that Mikhail Romanov be allowed to join only if he gave up his Roman Catholic faith and revert back to the Orthodox faith, and if he refused to do so, to renounce in writing all rights to the Russian throne. So now we begin Chapter 8. And it opens on June 2nd, 2015 at the State of Vatican City inside Rome, Italy. It was late afternoon on a brilliant June day in Rome, and Pope Nicholas was enjoying a solitary walk in the enclosed Vatican gardens. Swiss guards, ready to protect at any moment, stood by at a discreet distance. Birds sang merrily, bees buzzed in the sweet-scented blossoms, and a light breeze sifted through the rustling leaves, blending symphonically with the tinkling waters of two nearby fountains. As he walked, Nicholas looked down at his red shoes and thought of the terrible responsibility they represented, to be shepherd for the whole world, and one day to answer to Christ for the use he had made of his time in the chair of Peter the Apostle. Today, Tuesday, was Nicholas's 85th birthday. People said he had aged well, and perhaps still had several important years left to rule. His mind was clear, his health was stable, and his energy was remarkable for a man of his age. His full head of snow-white hair, which had never receded, invoked a certain youthfulness in his visage. Nicholas often sensed that it wasn't how much time one had to spend on earth, but how much real difference one dared to make, that mattered. While the world hurried on unawares, the church was engaged in a final battle with the devil for the salvation of souls. The modern world was all too comfortable with convenient abstractions, always talking about peoples or ethnic communities, simply new variants of the tired old Marxist fiction of the people. In reality, only individual souls existed. It was the eternal destiny of each individual soul that, in the end, mattered. Yes, individuals could form communities and nations, and such entities were also bound collectively by law of God. But to heal a nation spiritually, it was necessary to bring about the conversion of a great majority of the individual souls, compromising that nation. That was precisely why Nicholas found it so difficult to imagine that the nation of Russia, or any other modern nation for that matter, would ever actually convert. Truly a miraculous intervention by heaven would be required. Nicholas thought about the powerful forces entrenched within the Vatican itself that were opposed to heaven's plan for world peace through the salvation of individual souls on a vast scale. Some of these opponents were slaves to their pride and wanted the world to think highly of them as intelligent men, in tune with these progressive times. They wanted the Catholic faith to gradually meld into the emerging universal religion of man. They tended not to really believe in the immortality of the soul, eternal judgment, or the life of the world to come. To them the church was useful as a powerful existing organization, and they were content to enjoy their privileges and the human respect of their positions. Other highly placed churchmen were slaves to their passions. A few were womanizers, or lived as if married, despite their vow of celibacy. A great many more, it seemed, were afflicted with the disorder of same-sex attraction, which, according to timeless tradition, would have barred them from holy orders. Most of them had been profoundly wounded through abuse in their own childhood, or had been denied the normal psychological foundation and formation of manhood because of isolation and neglect. They should have pursued quiet lives of holiness and chastity in the lay state, accepting their particular cross of unnatural temptation and carrying it as best they could, but they should not have sought the honor and dignity of the priesthood, which was to be reserved only for normal men of outstanding character. The damage inflicted upon the church by the infiltration of those who had been unwilling to bow to these age-old ecclesiastical restrictions was incalculable. Still other men in the Vatican were conscious political infiltrators. He recalled how the former attorney for the Communist Party of America, after her late life conversion to the Catholic faith, testified that she had helped place more than 1,000 exceptionally talented agents in the Catholic seminaries back in the mid-20th century, and many of them were now at the zenith of their ecclesiastical careers. Such men never did believe in Christ, but only mocked him by pretending to believe through long years of rapid ascent due to their exceptional human abilities into the top echelons of the church hierarchy. They were saboteurs, all the while waiting for opportunities to undermine the church's reputation, influence, and clarity of teaching. Nicholas thought of numerous prominent bishops, recently retired, who had been major irritants to him throughout his entire career, and who had persistently flaunted the wishes of their Catholic faithful in the most obnoxious and self-righteous manner. They had stripped magnificent church buildings bare in all iconoclastic fury, promoted subversive sex education programs, and had disciplined none except those few brave clergy still leading lives of holiness and accurately teaching undiluted Catholic doctrine, the faith once delivered to the saints. Nicholas remembered how Jesus himself had chosen 12, and one of them turned out to be a traitor. Still he found encouragement in the growing numbers of traditional Catholics, including many young people who professed firm and uncompromising belief in what the Church had always held and taught. Many of them had been subjected to decades of unjust persecution within the Church, suffering repressive tactics reminiscent of those used against refuseniks in the former Soviet Union. Nicholas was glad that, in recent years, the liberation of the old Tridentine Mass and the ongoing theological discussions between Vatican officials and certain traditionalist groups had brought traditional Catholics into a wider, if still tentative, acceptance as part of the Catholic Church. Nicholas understood that traditionalists had never really been schismatic, since they never denied one tenet of the faith, nor did they ever deny the authority of the Pope. They had simply engaged in the equivalent of civil disobedience against the unjust imposition of certain new rules, such as the de facto banning of the ancient Mass, rules that were not logically reconcilable with tradition. As he walked, Nicholas came upon a garden statue of Our Lady of Fatima. This reminded him of the millions of rosaries which had been presented to him annually beginning in 2010 as a spiritual bouquet for the intention that the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary might be done in the precise manner requested at Fatima. Excuse me. The first year, the traditionalists had tallied more than 19 million rosaries, and in subsequent years the annual total had never been less than 12 million. Nicholas had the concerning sense that each year it was becoming even more clear to him that the prophetic message of Fatima was not at all in the past. He knew that the Vatican Secretary of State's document released in 2000, in which he had been complicit but with reservations, had contained the vision granted to the children at Fatima, but did not include the verbatim words of Our Lady explaining its meaning. Each of his predecessors had found those actual words of Our Lady too terrible to release because they seemed to foretell a disaster for the Church and the world. They had warned of a great apostasy from the faith, a diabolical disorientation, beginning with the Church and beginning at the top levels, following a confusing non-doctrinal pastoral council that would take place after 1960. Our Lady's words had clearly indicated the unspeakable shame of the widespread molestation of innocent children by consecrated souls. She had also warned of the coming annihilation of many nations. He remembered how Sister Lucy experienced a visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary in 1929 at Tui, Spain, where Mary told her to inform the Holy Father that it was now time to proceed with the consecration of Russia, exactly as first indicated on July 13, 1917 at Fatima. Then, in 1931, Sister Lucy experienced a visitation of the Lord Jesus in Rianjo, Spain, after which time he warned that the popes would suffer like the kings of France because they tarried too long in carrying out the request of heaven through his mother. Nicholas recalled how on June 17, 1689, Jesus had asked the King of France and his successors to consecrate their kingdom to his Sacred Heart, but they delayed until June 17, 1789, when Louis XVI had stripped of his when Louis XVI was stripped of his legislative powers and could no longer order it to be done precisely as heaven had requested. Louis XVI tried to do it in desperation from his prison cell where the French Revolution had put him, but in that place he could not do the consecration of France with the requested solemnity this ceremony needed. Nicholas stopped and performed some mental arithmetic. The consecration of Russia had first been mentioned in 1917, and the request to do it had come in 1929. It was now 2015, 98 years after the Fatima apparitions, and only 14 years before 2029, the 100-year deadline of the specific request at Tui. If not Nicholas, certainly the next pope would have to obey. Then Nicholas reminded himself of the little recognized diminishment of the power of the Holy Father that had followed Vatican II. Prior to the council, the Pope was clearly a monarch, and the heads of all Vatican congregations reported directly to him. After the council, the Vatican Secretary of State became a de facto prime minister, and all the heads of the Vatican congregations reported to him. In turn alone reported to the Holy Father. He in turn alone reported to the Holy Father. It had often seemed to Pope Nicholas that the Vatican Secretary of State actually held the real power, and that he, the Pope, was merely a figurehead who could be disobeyed with impunity just as long as the Secretary of State was complicit in the disobedience. For this reason, the Pope was probably powerless to command and a fulfillment of the Fatima request for the consecration of Russia, even if he wished to do so. Perhaps he was already in a hopeless position, analogous to Louis XVI after 1789, who from his prison cell was unable to solemnly and publicly consecrate France as heaven had requested. Nicholas believed that many of his subordinates, the Catholic bishops of the world, would now simply refuse to obey the Holy Father's order to publicly consecrate Russia, and then the Pope would be made to appear foolish and impotent in the eyes of the world. It would become known that he had no real power, and then the world would stop listening to him altogether. He would become irrelevant, a one-time monarch who no longer ruled even his own household. He liked to console himself with the idea that, under these circumstances, surely heaven could not hold him personally responsible for not consecrating Russia. A bell in a small campanile sounded, signaling the Holy Father that his time for exercises was ended, and that he must move on to his next obligation. A group of music students from Russia had come to play classical music for him in the reception hall of the Apostolic Palace in honor of his birthday. Therefore he needed to have an early supper and then get ready to greet them. Part B, Reception Hall in the Apostolic Palace, Tuesday evening. George Peterson and his wife, Katerina Vidovsky, had flown back to Moscow on Monday, where the Benboni Ardez Foundation had arranged a dress rehearsal at the Catholic Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. Their trip had proved to be uneventful, and they spent one night back at the comfortable and secure Moscow Hilton in Leningradzkaya. Father Popov visited them there late at night and entrusted them with the letter which they were to deliver in person to the Pope. However, their recent time back in Detroit had not been uneventful. While going about their daily routines at work, George and Katerina had each experienced several occasions when, unmistakably, they were being shadowed by evasive men who neither spoke nor clearly showed their faces. 3 days before their flight back to Moscow, they had returned after work to their downtown Detroit condominium to find it ransacked. Drawers were emptied on the floor, furniture and rugs were overturned, and mattresses and framed pictures were cut open. Packaged foods were spilled everywhere, since the entire house had been torn apart. There was reason to believe the intruders did not find what they were seeking, and the rage expressed by certain messages seemed to confirm this conclusion. On the stove, a photo of Katerina was partially incinerated on a burner. Adjacent to this was a 12-inch hand-carved wooden male figure of, quote, the man of La Mancha, unquote, brought to them from Spain by a friend, which had both its legs broken below the knees. In the middle of the entrance foyer was a 1962 Roman missal, lying open on the floor in a pile of human excrement, with a large kitchen knife thrust through it. All their crucifixes and religious statues had been piled in the fireplace and partially burned. On the walls and window shades, scatological, obscene, and blasphemous words and phrases were spray-painted in black. Metropolitan Filaret had warned them that dark forces might come seeking the letter, so that it was better kept locked in his hidden wall safe at the Cathedral of Christ the Savior until their return to Moscow. As they surveyed their ruined home with sadness, they remembered his warning that, by agreeing to deliver the Russian leader's letter of private pleading to the Pope, they would be declaring war on hell itself. From Moscow, with George and Katerina as chaperones, 6 of the Russian students who won high honors in piano and organ in the Sola Deo Gloria competition would now travel as the group to Rome, where they would play the piano for the Pope's birthday. Since the pipe organ had never been part of the Orthodox Church's musical tradition, 4 of the students were Catholic and planning to take part in the restoration of the traditional Catholic liturgy in Russia. 2 were orthodox and planned to use their organ skills in secular settings, but all were talented pianists and all were honored to be playing for the Pope. The group arrived in Rome at noon by air nonstop from Moscow and had been transported directly to a music conservatory not far from the Vatican, where several grand pianos were made available for the students to practice. Because it was summer semester, spare dormitory rooms were available for the night, and they had supper in the school cafeteria before the short drive to the Apostolic Palace for their performance. It was now 7 o'clock in the evening, and George and Katerina and the 6 students sat nervously in the reception hall, awaiting the entrance of the Holy Father. None of them had ever met a pope before, or even seen one in person. As Katerina remembered that the musical performance in honor of the Pope's birthday was not the main reason why she and George had come, her anxiety increased. They were going to be meeting the Pope in person in private, and were going to deliver to him a letter from Russia, which might be exceedingly troubling to him. Everyone who knew anything about Fatima knew that this Pope had long ago been complicit, as a cardinal, in the Vatican Secretary of State's 2000 document, implying that Fatima was now all in the past. Suddenly 2 Swiss guards appeared through huge double doors, and one announced in military manner the arrival of the Pope. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for His Holiness Pope Nicholas VI, reigning monarch of the State of Vatican City, Pontifex Maximus, and servant of the servants of God." Immediately Pope Nicholas strode through the doors, his bright red shoes gleaming beneath his white cassock, his face beaming. He stopped before each of the 8 guests, beginning with George and Katerina, greeting them in person. Those who were Catholic knelt to kiss his apostolic ring, thus making a public display of their submission to his supreme authority in spiritual matters. Then he raised each one up by grasping both hands and smiling and thanking them for coming to honor him on this special personal day. He then signaled for them all to be seated, while a guard brought up a chair for him so that he could face the group at an intimate but comfortable distance. The Steinway concert grand piano, which had been a gift to the Apostolic Palace from a group of famous symphony conductors, had been strategically positioned so that the entire group, including the Pope, would be able to enjoy an unobstructed view of the keyboard. "A few years ago, students, when I was about your age," he chuckled, "I fancied myself to be a future concert pianist. My dear brother Frederick and I spent several years studying together at the top music conservatory in our home state of Bavaria, but God had other plans for both of us, and instead we found our way to the seminary, where we both became priests. Still, music has always held a special place in my life, and still serves to calm my soul when the pressures of work weigh down upon me, and I like to think that those who already know how to make beautiful music will have a bit of a head start if they should some day make it to heaven, where the angels and saints ever sing to God. So it is a great joy to me tonight that some of Russia's most talented young musicians will grace this wonderful concert grand piano with the youthful passion of their refined playing. And then, will you play for us too, Your Holiness?" asked one nervous but eager student. "Rumor has it that the Holy Father himself may play a note or two at the conclusion, but only if you have not played too well." Then he laughed, and his octogenarian eyes sparkled. "Please begin." Katerina arose first, went to the piano, and launched into a complex classical rendition of Happy Birthday, while the students all sang to His Holiness in 4-part harmony, first in Russian, then in German, then in Italian, and finally in Latin. At the conclusion, the Holy Father beamed and said, "Thank you, students. Some people will claim that I am fluent in each of those languages, But when I hear Latin, then I truly feel at home, for it has been the universal language of the Church since its founding, and as we grow old we find ourselves less impressed by whatever is new, and instead we find ourselves comforted by that which does not change. The first performer now arose and moved to the piano bench as Katerina returned to her seat. His flawless rendition of the Tchaikovsky Piano Sonata was followed by other students performing works of Beethoven, Liszt, Reinberger, and Romanov, and finally a little-known composer named Kirill Romanov, performed by Maria Peterson. The Pope was delighted with the whole program. "Many thanks to all of you fine young people," said the Pope, "for sharing your well-developed talent with an aging Pope tonight. Each of the first 5 composers are among my favorites. Now the final work was majestic yet hauntingly beautiful, capturing the very soul of Russian music, but I have to confess that its composer is unknown to me. Who is this Kirill Romanov? Perhaps a relative of the Russian royal family?" "Holy Father," answered Maria, "I also have something to confess. Unlike the other performers here tonight, I am Russian, but not really from Russia. My mother was born there, but I have grown up in Detroit, in the United States, and there in Detroit we have a humble and holy priest named Father Kirill Romanov, who is a very talented pianist and composer. It was he who wrote the work you just heard." "It was delightful," responded Nicholas. "You know, I have a personal assistant, Father John Harold, who is from Detroit. We are nearly the same age and have lived to see many changes. My predecessor released Father Harold from his vows as a member of the Society of Jesus, and now Father Harold spends part of each year here in Rome assisting me with special projects and providing spiritual direction to some very prominent religious people who are probably saints in the making. The rest of the time he stays in Detroit, where he teaches the real Catholic faith without compromise, both through live lectures and recordings. He has often mentioned that his parish there has exquisite music, with a Gregorian chant schola, a very talented young organist, and a Latin choir offering periodic orchestral masses by the great Catholic polyphonic composers. I have been impressed to hear that these masses are offered in the traditional Roman rite for which they were intended. Let me see, I believe the parish name has something to do with Fatima. Yes, that is my home parish, Our Lady of Fatima Catholic Church, often known as the Cova. Father Romanov is both our pastor and our music director." "Ah, yes, that is exactly where Father Harold stays. He has often spoken of the parish's wonderful replica of the little chapel at the Cova de Ira, the very spot where the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to the little shepherds in Portugal. I believe, he said, it was out in the back of the parish cemetery, right in the middle of the city of Detroit. Father Harold often feels that it is the same to pray there as if it were at the original shrine in Portugal. And if I were not a virtual prisoner in this ancient palace, being bossed around by the Secretary of State and the other cardinals, I myself would like to go there some day for a visit. Incognito, mind you, like a little church mouse in the corner, and hear one of those orchestral masses and to pray at that Cova." "Holy Father," asked one of the young Russians, "may we have the privilege now of hearing you play for us?" "Well, I would be justified in refusing, you know, because I warned you that if you played too well, I would reserve the right not to follow. But one is permitted a greater number of wrong notes at my age. Some people try to say a pope should not play concert piano music, but for me, performing on the piano is my human passion. It is what I thought I wanted to do before God called me to the priesthood. And a little bit of it, every now and then, helps to keep an old pope sane, if that is possible. Now my predecessor used to ski the Alps during the first few years that he was pope, and people also frowned on that, one cartoonist even calling it the scouse of the fishermen. But that was his way of renewing himself athletically and psychologically. In Europe, nearly everyone skis, and it does not have any connotation of being a sport such just for the rich. Perhaps these things are not unlike the times when St. Peter would go fishing again when he was in despair, or when St. Paul would continue his former craft of making tents even while he was traveling to preach the gospel. With that, the Holy Father arose, moved to the piano, and seated himself on the bench. The bright red shoes of the fisherman gleamed beneath his white cassocks as his right foot found the sustain pedal, and the left foot depressed the sostenuto pedal, hinting at a thundering bass beginning. Immediately the students heard a masterful performance of Romanoff's Piano Sonata No. 1 in F sharp minor in 3 movements, lasting altogether almost 40 minutes, performed entirely from memory. By the time the Holy Father had finished, various cardinals, priests, seminarians, and nuns had crept into the back room, about 50 in all, so that a thunderous applause and shouts of bravo erupted after the final chord fell silent. "Happy birthday, Holy Father," they all cheered. "Nicholas is the Pope for us." His Holiness smiled and nodded to the gathered crowd humbly, and then greeted each of the students again, one by one, thanking them for their special trip to honor him. He invited them to attend Mass the next morning in his private chapel, noting that the Tridentine Mass was his ordinary daily Mass. Finally, he came to George and Katerina and invited them to come with him into his private office for a personal visit. Part C of Chapter 8, Papal Private Office, Apostolic Palace, Tuesday, late evening. The Pope's private office had 2 large windows overlooking St. Peter's Square. Glassed-in bookshelves occupied a second wall, a marble fireplace graced a third wall, and the fourth wall was covered with a huge mural dating back from the Renaissance, depicting biblical scenes of St. Peter. In one scene, Christ was handing Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and in another scene, he glanced in sorrow at Peter, just as the cock crowed. In yet another scene, Peter was shown hearing the confession of a penitent, and lastly, Peter was seen baptizing a Roman soldier of his household. A huge desk of intricate inlaid wood stood before the mural. In front of the desk was a comfortable seating area of upholstered chairs and tables with lamps, and small ottoman footstools designed for relaxed conversation in a circle. The Holy Father motioned for George and Katerina to be seated in 2 of the chairs facing each other, and he then sat between them, putting his red shoes up on the small ottoman. He rang a small handbell, and 2 sisters in full religious habit entered, bringing coffee and a light dessert. Nicholas smiled warmly at his nervous guests, and they began. This is the way a private audience works for people whom the Pope feels he already knows, even if we have not met before. "You are from Father Harold's parish in Detroit, and your daughter plays wonderfully and speaks Russian like a native. I have 2 of your organ compact discs, Katerina, and I even heard you perform live once in Rome at the wonderfully restored pipe organ in the academic hall of the Pontifical Institute of Sacred Music. Back then I was still a cardinal and could go to such things without a lot of hoopla. And you, George, have quite a reputation with the Archbishop of Detroit for helping him with difficult cases of emotional disturbance in souls pursuing holiness. I am aware of several cases where you helped clear the way for much-needed exorcisms. Quite remarkable for a scientist who, I am told, was once a stubborn agnostic. George blushed, but he decided against scowling at his dear wife, who must have somehow spoken of his better forgotten past to someone who knew the Pope. Father Harold, no doubt, he decided. It is a joy to see how you are working with the youth of Russia to revive and foster great Western music, said the Pope. The Catholics in Russia have a hard time of it because the Orthodox are so afraid we are going to steal souls away from them. The Orthodox priests think they have it so hard there because most Russians do not practice any religion. But it has become just as bad for Catholic priests in formerly Catholic Europe, where hardly anyone goes to church, and those who do are openly mocked at social gatherings. Excuse me. It is not so much that any Catholics and Orthodox are competing with each other. It is that the world, the flesh, and the devil are actively competing with the flame of faith in souls. Holy Father, began George, Katerina and I have something special to present to you tonight. It is a letter to your Holiness from 2 prominent Russians, Filaret III, Patriarch of Moscow, and all Russia, and Vasily Polzin, the President of the Russian Federation. But this is awkward. Why could they not send it through the usual diplomatic couriers? Your Holiness, the Patriarch explained to us in person that he was afraid to send you this communication through any of the official channels, for fear that it would be intercepted, either in Russia or in the Vatican, by men opposed to the idea it presents. So he asked us to promise to personally deliver it to you this evening. Katerina opened her purse, withdrew a sealed envelope bearing the official seal of the Russian Federation, and handed it to Nicholas. For the first time in this long evening, Katerina thought she detected a slight tremor in the Holy Father's hands as he reached out to grasp the document. Judging from the method of delivery, I can predict that this communication will not be consistent with current international politics, so I can assume it will not be consistent with the Church's official policy of Ostpolitik, seeking to build bridges through dialogue with the Orthodox churches. Nevertheless, we took it to be very good, Your Holiness. So you have read it then? Yes, at the request of Patriarch Filaret, or Filaret, it's probably Filaret, before it was sealed in this envelope in our presence. Well then, you won't mind if you have to wait a few moments while the Pope tries to get to speed with all you Russians, Nicholas chuckled. George and Katerina sat silently while the Pope opened the envelope and read the unsettling letter of supplication inside. When the Pope had finished reading, he sat in silence for several minutes, head bowed, praying. Some will say this is the best birthday gift any Pope could wish for, but I am terrified, and a sense of dread is enveloping me. Others will say it is a cruel curse to inflict an old man of 85 Do you have any idea what this will mean? We suppose it will change the world, Your Holiness. Let us hope so, because if it does not, publicly acting upon this letter could bring great ridicule and scorn down upon the Church and the papacy. I will have to pray fervently to determine if this is still the will of heaven after all these decades of delay. The risks of acting as requested in this letter are incalculable. Father Gottschalk, who runs the Fatima Herald apostolate in Detroit, says the risks of not doing the consecration are incalculable, retorted George. Yes, I know quite a bit about Father Gottschalk. He is a holy priest and a good man. Father John Harold speaks well of him, but however well-intentioned he might be, for decades he has been a big thorn in the side of the Vatican. Because of him, we have never enjoyed complete peace about our Ostpolitik or about our project for Christian unity through ecumenical dialogue. Father Gottschalk has kept traditional Catholics stirred up, believing the consecration of Russia is the only viable path to world peace because it is heaven's mandate. I have to tell you that enormous pressures have been brought upon me by the Secretary of State and a number of other cardinals to defrock him, but he has done nothing wrong. I sometimes wonder if he may actually be the Holy Father's best friend, even though my advisors tell me he is my worst enemy. Truth can never be the enemy, can it, Your Holiness? Asked Katerina. The Pope winced and then almost groaned with weariness. Holy Father, said George, we know it is getting late, and you must be very tired already. Let us take our leave so that you will have time to reflect upon the Russian request. The Holy Father nodded, smiling with apparent relief. The Russian request, you say? Perhaps this is how this unprecedented and unforeseen document will come to be called in the annals of church history. The Russian request, you say? Perhaps that is how this unprecedented and unforeseen document will come to be called in the annals of church history. We will see you at Mass in the morning, and if there is already any private message to take back to Moscow, you can give it to us afterward. George and Katerina knelt, and Nicholas blessed them, and then bid them good night. Now there is still a part D to chapter 8, which I will read in the next YouTube. Thanks for listening.